Hello and welcome back to another episode of What If Harry Was Heir Slytherin? Chapter 7, A Letter for Hogwarts. A Letter for Hogwarts. For the days between his letter arriving and his next day cleaning with Mrs. Fig, Harry kept his head down and just followed the Dursleys' orders. Though it still made him crazy enough to want to scream, he just kept repeating to himself that it wouldn't be for long. 1 month plus 1 week, then he'd be away for the school year. It may as well be an eternity distant. He grew used to the veil partitioning his memory, practiced thinking about things related to what was hidden there without drawing it open. If he found out about the Watcher, if the wizard was able to see into his soul as Nagini had implied, he didn't want to risk being unprepared. He practiced while cooking, practiced while running from Dudley, practiced while lying in bed waiting for sleep. It helped take his mind off the limitations of his existence at present. The morning of his chance to write his reply, Harry woke to the sound of Aunt Petunia banging on his cupboard, unlatching the slide bolts and shrilly ordering him to hurry up with breakfast. He cooked the meal, collected the mail and brought it to his uncle, cleared up after the meal, and allowed Dudley to almost catch him as they ran around the yard. Finally Dudley's friends cornered him, and he was unable to escape their practice for hitting people, but then they let him go to get dressed for work. He changed from his dirty stained-too-large outfit to his cleaner stained-too-large outfit. The school owl sat on the fence by number 4 waiting, as it had for the days since its initial delivery of Harry's letter despite Aunt Petunia's attempts to scare it away. Harry supposed it must hunt during the night, because he had not seen it move beyond tilting its head around and hopping in place or picking at its foot or feathers. He would have a reply for it to take back soon. He silently begged it to wait just a few hours longer as he hurried past it toward Mrs. Fig's. He had considered long and hard how to explain his state of affairs to the school. They clearly had little idea of what his life was like, if they thought he would be able to just go out to the train station. Without his aunt or uncle driving him there, or someone from the school picking him up, he'd never manage. Professor Quirrell was magically prevented from entering Privet Drive, but Harry hoped that, if worst came to worst, he could convince him to meet somewhere like the park, and from there they could go to the train station together. At that point, he would be safe from his relatives' retaliation whatever they thought of him running off with a strange man. He went straight to the writing desk. Professor McGonagall. My aunt and uncle will not be interested in allowing me to attend any sort of school except the local Muggle high school. I hope you don't require their consent as I would very much prefer to go to Hogwarts. But I will need help getting my school things, and probably a ride to the train station for start of term 2. Please tell me if there's anything else I need to do to be ready. Thank you. Harry Potter. There. That should do it. Harry had considered putting in an apology for causing them trouble, or offering to pay for their time, but thought that might seem too desperate. If he was as rich and famous as Quirrell had indicated, they would probably be happy to accommodate him. And if not, he was sure the professor would be able to help him. He had decided to be brief and professional about the whole affair. There was no point blathering on about his whole life story. He wanted to attend, needed help arranging things, that was all there was to say. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and wrote Professor McGonagall, Hogwarts School on the front, tucked it into his pocket. The only advantage to wearing Dudley's oversized cast-off clothing was the excessive pocket space. Only once that was taken care of did he open Quirrell's reply. He gave a satisfactory overview of the classes Harry had inquired after, then explained that ghosts were wizards whose spirit refused to die along with their bodies. But without a physical mutable form, they would be stuck as the same version of themselves as they had been at the moment of their death, unable to really learn or change beyond their immediate context. It was a state to be avoided if possible, as being without a body left you also incapable of magic. Quirrell didn't see how they could have a culture, though he noted that it was considered impolite to bring up that they were dead. Sometimes they didn't realize they had died, other times they just chose to ignore it, and neither type wanted the truth shoved in their incorporeal faces. Harry was feeling anxious now, wondering if he should have said more in his letter to McGonagall, so his reply to Quirrell was long and full of his concerns about the future. Would Hogwarts be willing to go to so much trouble just to get one student to attend? Was Harry really that important? Would they need his aunt and uncle to consent? Would he ever be able to get a wand if he wasn't allowed to attend the school? What would happen to him if he didn't get taught? Would his power keep getting stronger? He signed his name at the bottom, stared at the rambling for a moment, considered throwing it out, then folded it determinedly and stuffed it in an envelope. He gave that to Mrs. Fig to send, then set about cleaning her dining room. This was the least used room in the house, he realized at once, and would require more than one afternoon's cleaning. By the time he left, he was satisfactorily covered in dust and cobwebs, which would make his aunt pleased if nothing else. He walked home, one hand on the letter in his pocket, the other fiddling nervously with a loose thread that hung off his frayed sleeve. He arrived at Privet Drive, surprised to find no sign of Dudley or his friends. They must have gone out while he was at Mrs. Figg's. He looked around again, checking for his aunt, but the yard was empty and silent. He brought out the letter, held it up to the school owl. It peered at him, then hopped off the fence and onto his other arm, held out a foot. "Gotcha!" Harry screamed. The owl flapped into the air as Harry whirled. Dudley snatched the letter and grinned triumphantly. "I knew you were up to something," he sneered. "No one's ever that happy to go cleaning." "Give that back," Harry demanded, trying to snatch the letter. But his cousin held it away, up out of Harry's reach. "You were only going to feed it to the owl," Dudley said. "You want it, you'll have to fight me for it." He held up his other fist in front of his chest, ready. Harry's momentary courage wilted. But he couldn't let Dudley read the letter, and he really couldn't let him give it to Aunt Petunia. He had no chance of winning a fight. He had to get it back some other way. He stared at his shoes, slumped in a convincing imitation of defeat. Dudley laughed. "Now, what would someone like you be writing about?" Harry glanced up at the school owl, which had resumed its seat on the fence and was watching with a disgruntled expression. Its eyes followed the letter as though it wanted to grab it. Dudley moved to open the letter and Harry seized the opportunity. His cousin was distracted, not ready, and Harry grabbed the letter away. Dudley lunged for it, but Harry had desperation on his side. He twisted the envelope away with a ripping sound that seemed to echo in his ears. "Take it to Hogwarts," Harry shouted to the owl, threw the letter as hard as he could into the air just before Dudley tackled him bodily. He feared for a moment that nothing would happen, that it would fall to the ground and Dudley would grab it instead, but the owl knew its job well. It swooped on the crumpled envelope, winging away with it before Dudley could hope to stop it. The larger boy was left with less than 2 inches of paper, but he sat on Harry to prevent him getting up and unfolded it anyway. "Professor. My aunt and Ella win except th, you don't prefer to g getting my the train s. Please tell me do to be ready thank you, Harry Potter." Dudley waved the paper in Harry's face. "Professor? Be ready? The train? Thank you." His voice rose to a shout. "Who have you been writing to? What's Hogwarts?" Harry heard his aunt give a little shriek from inside the house, and a moment later her head popped out of the open bedroom window. "What did you say?" she yelled. Dudley waved the paper in the air proudly. "Harry was trying to give an owl a letter, but I got part of it away." Aunt Petunia fainted, toppling backwards out of view. Harry's heart sank. He was sure there was enough in the remaining part of the letter for McGonagall to understand his position, but there was obviously enough in this piece to incriminate him. Why had he said Hogwarts out loud? It was obvious that Aunt Petunia had recognized that word particularly. Why hadn't he just said McGonagall or the professor or even just "here's my reply"? It was too late now. The secret was out, and he could see no way to slither out of trouble this time. Dudley locked Harry in his cupboard personally, at Petunia's command the moment she recovered. Harry heard her pacing the house, knew she'd be fluttering her hands with a look of panic on her face. He'd seen it before when she was expecting important guests. It meant she would be snappish and quick to yell. But he was already locked in, actually locked, which normally was only done overnight, and could envision no way out of this. Uncle Vernon would be furious, he always was when Harry caused his wife trouble, and Harry had never seen her so worked up. For something like this, even his worst fears seemed too lenient. He tried to stop thinking of what could happen, but his imagination seemed stuck on searching for the worst possible outcomes. But why would Aunt Petunia recognize the word Hogwarts specifically, he asked himself. Tried to distract his mind, challenged himself to puzzle it out. She seemed to understand the implications of the owl as well. He remembered thinking once that his relatives knew the truth and hated him for it, thought back to how every mention of magic, every fairy tale or fantasy movie, had been banned from mention within the Dursley household. Harry recalled when Dudley had wanted to go see the rented video of E.T. with his friends. Petunia had ignored his tantrums and flatly refused, instead promised him a whole pie of his own if he dropped the subject and never brought it up again. After all, the poster had a flying bicycle on it, and bicycles did not fly. Throughout Harry's whole life, anything even close to dealing with magic had been shunted aside from the Dursleys' lives. Deliberately so, he now realized. They knew enough about the wizard world to hate it. He had heard from Quirrell about Lord Voldemort's war of conquest. It had ended when Harry was a baby. Perhaps they knew something about that? Thought all wizards were like that? Harry shook his head. That didn't fit. The way Aunt Petunia looked, it was hatred and fear, but not that sort. The personal sort. The look that came from being wronged on a level that Harry knew the depth of full well. She was the sister to Harry's mother. Had she been the one from whom Harry inherited his magical abilities? Had Petunia felt outshone, perhaps, by her witch sister? Jealousy could be a powerful motivator. Or it could be Harry's father. A wizard, sweeping Petunia's sister off her feet with his foreign power, perhaps literally charming her away from her family? That would explain the hatred as well. Harry sighed and leaned back on his lumpy mattress. He didn't have enough information to solve this. The past was too far away, too long ago, and too well hidden. He wondered what Uncle Vernon would do to him when he got home from work. He worried if the crumpled partial letter would be enough. He couldn't remember exactly what he'd written, hadn't seen what part Dudley had torn off. From the words he'd read off, though, it was plenty incriminating for the Dursleys to justify any restrictions against him. His days of blithely running off to Mrs. Figg's house for his secret correspondences would be over. He hoped he hadn't caused her any trouble. Even if she was a bit loony, it was nice having an adult around who wasn't determined to make his life miserable. And his last letter to Quirrell had been nothing but complaining. Why had he talked about himself so much? He should have been more diligent in making the professor understand Harry's gratitude, that he valued their friendship more than anything he'd ever had. Now it was too late. He was locked in, and didn't see that he would ever be allowed outside the house again. He'd tricked them, betrayed the tiny trust they'd placed in him, and now they knew he was involved with wizards. For a family that so despised magic, what greater crime could there be? He knew he'd go mad. Alone in his cupboard, but at least he had snakes to talk to. He sat bolt upright, his forehead connected firmly with the stair above him. He winced at the pain, shoved it aside along with the veil on his memory to access his secret ability. You all talk to each other, relay messages, right? He hissed to the current occupants of his cupboard, a pair of grayish-brown snakes with similar patterning who seemed to be having a silent, disdainful argument of some kind. They looked up at him, twisted into mirrored upright coils to see him better. Yes, we are able to relay messages. Master Not Master is the only wizard to whom we could convey them. Tell him I've been caught, that I won't be able to send any more letters. Ask him what I should do. It will be conveyed, the snakes replied, nodding their heads in near unison. Thanks. He lay back down, rubbing at his head. He hated his cupboard, his prison, but at least it was the one place that was his. The Dursleys never rearranged his possessions, never more than glanced inside to get him up or call him to work. Harry pulled his stack of letters from under the mattress. 4 from Quirrell, and the Hogwarts official 1 from McGonagall. He reread them each, slowly, line by line. Committing their already memorized words to heart, even the list of equipment. He lingered on that, knowing it to be the last page, tried to imagine every possible use for each listed item. He was especially intrigued by the line proclaiming first years are not allowed their own broomsticks. Quirrell's list of school subjects had included flying, and he'd asked after it. He rotated the final letter from Quirrell to the top of the stack, read it again. Alone of his wizard correspondence, this one he hadn't fully memorized, having only received it a few hours previously. He was rereading the professor's overview of classes and ghosts for the 5th time when he heard the front door open. Dudley called from the living room that, Mum's upstairs with a headache, she was really furious today about something Harry did. Harry stuffed the letters back under his mattress as fast as he could, lay down on his side and pretended to be asleep as Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps approached his cupboard door. He changed his mind, sat up with his legs crossed in front of him, tried to look repentant, knew that whatever he did his uncle would find fault with it. The bolts unlatched, the door was flung open. Harry squinted against the light, used to the dimness. What did you do to upset my wife? He thundered. How dare you? I'm sorry, Uncle Vernon, Harry said, looking away. The truth that he was the one being wronged, that this was all so unfair and absurd wanted to burst out of him, but now of all times he had to keep his tongue in check. Angry words are not careful words, he reminded himself. Sorry? Sorry for what? Sorry that you upset her, or sorry about what you did? Harry couldn't answer, his throat was already thick with tears. He was afraid, and he was angry, and he was afraid of what he could do because he was angry, and he didn't care, but he was so tired of this. His uncle's face was puffed up and crimson, and he didn't even know the whole story yet. Harry had never seen him so angry. He tried to give a letter to an owl, Dudley said helpfully. Harry wanted to slap his smirking mouth so badly. Vernon's face turned a shade deeper, almost purple. You what? He roared. An owl? A letter? Have you gone mad? Vernon, he's been talking to them. Petunia's voice was faint, as though she was terrified or else on the verge of tears. She held out the strip of Harry's letter in a trembling hand. I think he was planning to run away. Vernon's fists were clenched, his face no longer enough to contain his fury. How did you do it? He asked, jabbing a finger toward Harry's face. How did you manage this? He shook the torn letter under Harry's nose. Harry really was crying now, unable to stop himself. He couldn't have answered if he'd wanted to. It was that old crazy Mrs. Fig, Dudley said, proud to contribute to the conversation. Harry seemed awful happy to go clean for her, so I got suspicious. I waited for him to come back, and that's when I caught him with that letter. Where's the rest of it? Vernon asked, his voice going flat and dark. The owl took it, Dudley said. To that place, Petunia added faintly. Vernon turned his glare on Harry, his voice leaving no room for compromise. You will not be going anywhere with anyone, you understand me, boy? We agreed to take you in, with one purpose. You will grow up to be normal. You hear me? Harry had taken enough. 2 months ago, he would have nodded meekly and accepted his punishment. But now, he knew he had options. He knew that this didn't have to be his future. He knew that he could dare more. I am going to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Harry yelled, sitting up on his knees so his head brushed the top of the cupboard, staring Uncle Vernon right in the eyes. Angry. Defiant. I am a wizard, and nothing any muggles say about it will change that fact. He felt so calm, suddenly, as though his angry outburst had spent all his aggression. He could almost see magic, could feel the true power within him. He said the first thing that came to mind. Loomis, Harry whispered. And a dazzling light blazed out from a spot just in front of his chest. Vernon winced and backed away a step. Dudley gasped and flinched. Petunia swooned. I am a wizard, Harry repeated, his voice confident as the flare of light began to fade. I am leaving now. Don't try to follow me. He grabbed his stack of letters, jumped out of the cupboard, and sprinted for the door. Vernon recovered from his shock, jumped at Harry with a roar. Harry's heart was racing as he just managed to dodge his uncle's attempt to grab him. He nearly tripped over his too long pant leg, stumbled, recovered. Vernon lunged again, but Harry had years of experience running and dodging from Dudley's training. He threw the door open and raced down the drive. He couldn't believe what he'd done, but he was committed now. Harry turned the corner and sprinted for Mrs. Fig's house, the only place he could think where he might be safe. He shoved the front door open, ran through, slammed it closed behind him. He couldn't seem to catch his breath, and he felt worn out somehow in a way he never had before. His forehead throbbed, both a dull ache from where he bumped it and the sharp pain through his scar that came and went seemingly without reason. It was stronger today, much stronger. Who's there? Mrs. Fig demanded in a slightly wavering voice from her bedroom. It's me, Harry, he replied, panting for breath. He reached up to lock the door, and only then noticed it was already bolted for the night. Except the bolt was just gone, like the bars from his door. I may have ruined your luck. I'm sorry about that. Oh, dear boy, what's the matter? She was wearing a nightgown covered in cartoon cats as she emerged into the hall, which somehow made her look less mad than usual. Harry couldn't think what to say, so he just stood and waited as she came over. She gently wrapped her arms around him, and he was suddenly sobbing. All the fear, all the stress, all the worry and hope and truth and lies, it was just too much for him to hold in any longer. She didn't seem to know what to say either. Harry didn't care. She silently held him, and he cried wordlessly. He didn't need words. He just someone to be there for him. Chapter 8, The Representative. The Representative. Harry wrote another letter the next morning, explaining in greater detail what had transpired. He wrote one to McGonagall, one to Quirrell, another to Quirrell, and then a second to McGonagall with fewer details and a bit more succinct. He crumpled the first, then glanced between his 2 letters to Quirrell. Though there was some duplicate information, he decided to include both. He wrote a third explaining a few more things, asking a few more questions that came to mind, and begging for a way to leave early. It was 3 days short of his birthday, which fell on the last day of July. Then he had to make it through August. While staying on Mrs. Fig's sofa was a fine solution for one night, he doubted his aunt and uncle would stay intimidated. Vernon would have regained his courage and his fury by now, and Harry couldn't imagine his reception would be polite. They would know he came here, and they would not just allow matters to stand. They had legal custody of him, after all. If Mrs. Figg refused to send him back, they could have her arrested for kidnapping or something. Uncle Vernon had always put great store by the effectiveness of the government. Harry laid his head on his arm, stared sideways at the letters strewn across the desk. It was barely past sunrise, no one else was awake in the neighborhood but perhaps the milkman or paperboy. He was so tired of worrying, but he couldn't make himself stop. His mind just kept replaying, over and over, every possible scenario, each worse than the last. He couldn't think of a single way out. Quirrell couldn't come for him. He couldn't get to anyone. Mrs. Figg was his only protection, and a meager one she would prove in the face of the law. Harry groaned, flopped his other arm over his face. He was so tired of it all. He sat up at last, added a postscript to his third letter to Quirrell, then folded them all and shoved them into an envelope. He reread his letter to McGonagall, decided it wasn't good enough and rewrote it again. By the time Mrs. Figg walked by toward the kitchen, Harry had 6 discarded drafts and no idea what he would say. He smoothed out the first version, which upon rereading seemed less lacking than it had previously. He copied it out to a new page with a few minor alterations, stuffed it in an envelope, then hurried to the kitchen. "I'm sorry breakfast isn't ready, I didn't know what you wanted." Mrs. Figg gave a quiet squeak, then relaxed when she saw Harry. "Oh, I forgot you were here, my goodness." She put a hand to her chest. "I haven't had visitors overnight in so long. I'm sorry." "If you don't have enough food for me, that's fine," Harry said, though his stomach grumbled in protest. "Nonsense," she said briskly, and set about assembling a batter. Harry had always used mixes. The Dursleys didn't want there to be any chance of him slipping up, so it was fascinating watching her deftly measure out all the ingredients without pause, moving with the confident rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He was spellbound. She didn't even seem to measure half the time, grabbing a handful of sugar, shaking her hand as though weighing it by instinct, tossing in salt by pinching it between her fingers. She hummed quietly, her voice creaky and occasionally off-key, but Harry thought it was beautiful. She seemed not to notice his presence, so he just sat at the table and watched, glad of the distraction from his thoughts. Shufflepaws wandered in, Mrs. Figg's newest, a large gray cat with gold eyes. The cat glared at Harry disdainfully before jumping up on his lap and kneading his paws against Harry's legs. It tickled terribly, and Harry squirmed and giggled. Mrs. Figg turned, still mixing the batter with one hand, the bowl held securely in the other. "You're in his seat," she said, but chuckled to make it clear she wasn't ordering him to move. "Seems he likes you well enough though, don't you, Shuffly?" The cat didn't deign to acknowledge her, continuing his detailed inspection of Harry. Harry sighed with relief as the cat finally settled down, as though Harry's lap were the most natural place in the world for a nap. He found he rather enjoyed the feeling of Shufflepaws, warm and soft and heavy. He would like a cat someday. A snake slithered in through the hallway door, hissing softly to itself. It eyed Shufflepaws with its head raised, tasting the air with its flickering tongue. "Be nice," Harry hissed to it, instinctively sliding through the veil in his mind. "This is a friend." "What was that?" Mrs. Figg asked, watching him with a look of complete surprise. Harry turned to her, startled. It's a wizard thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." "I've never heard a wizard do that," Mrs. Figg replied, then shrugged. "I suppose you'd know better than me," she said, a poorly concealed hint of bitterness in her tone. Harry realized he'd been insensitive, but couldn't think of a way to apologize without seeming condescending, and the last thing he wanted was to alienate his one ally. "It's a very rare ability," he said instead. "I'm not surprised you haven't met another." Mrs. Figg nodded. She heated up a frying pan and began pouring the batter out in neat even ovals. Harry was surprised by how thick and fluffy the pancakes were when she finished. She had the batch done within a few minutes, piled them on a plate and offered it to Harry. It felt like an eternity since he was last allowed to eat breakfast. He had never tasted anything so delicious in his life, he believed, cat hair, slight metallic taste, and all. He ate all of them by the time she was finishing the second batch, and she offered him all but one of those as well. He accepted gratefully. She nibbled the last pancake with one hand while with the other she rinsed the bowl and frying pan out, started frying the ham. Thick slices, a bit on the old side, but more filling than anything Harry had been allowed in years. Aside from the sheer novelty of eating something he hadn't prepared, he couldn't recall the last time he'd actually been completely satisfied with his portion. Harry thanked her profusely, and then a few more times for good measure. "Please, don't mention it," she said. "If there had been a way to have you over for breakfast all these years, I would have done so." "I'll probably never be allowed back once they recapture me," Harry said glumly. "They won't trust you now." Mrs. Fig shrugged. "I couldn't stand by another year without at least trying," she said. "I hope it wasn't the wrong decision." "I think right now is when I need you the most," he said after a moment. Just over a month, and he'd be off to Hogwarts. He'd have friends, allies, his wealth and power and status to aid him. He could make arrangements well in advance, never spend a minute longer than needed in his relative's cupboard. It was now, the fragile nexus between past and future, between fear and hope, when he really needed an ally. Mrs. Fig smiled. "I'm glad to hear it. I only hope in a few years you will be able to still believe that." Someone pounded on the door. Harry's spirits dipped, threatened to plummet again. He knew it was Uncle Vernon, come to reclaim him. "Don't let him take me back," he whispered, knowing full well it was a futile request. "I don't want to go back there." Mrs. Fig patted his head. "I'll do whatever I can, but I'm afraid it won't be much." Harry nodded, shrank lower in his chair. Shufflepaws lifted his head, glared at Harry reproachfully, jumped down and walked away with his tail in the air. Harry wanted to hide under the table, crawl under the sofa, find someplace to hide and just refuse to leave. He heard Mrs. Fig's voice, Vernon's angry tones, Petunia's sharp interjections. He couldn't make out the words. His aunt and uncle were both talking fiercely, but quietly, probably wary of being overheard. It sounded like the argument was getting louder, sharper. Finally, the voices stopped, and Harry heard the door click firmly shut. He watched the hallway warily, but heard only Mrs. Fig's footsteps coming. She sighed, then sat down opposite him. "I told them you weren't here, that I didn't know who you were writing to. They didn't seem convinced, but they left for now. Petunia wanted me to promise not to allow you to write here any longer, or you'd not be allowed to work for me in future. I lost my temper then, said more than I meant to." She let out another sigh. "They'll be back, I'm sure. I'm sorry." "Thank you," Harry whispered. "I'll find somewhere else to stay. I don't want to cause you any trouble." "Tell me before you go anywhere," Mrs. Fig said sternly. "I won't have you disappearing on me. I'd be worrying for weeks." Harry nodded agreement. It still felt so strange, every time he realized that someone actually cared about what happened to him. "I have letters to send," he told her. She nodded, accepted the envelopes. She unlocked the guest bedroom door, which turned out to be a chilly and mostly empty room with an open window. An owl sat on a perch by the corner, hooted softly when it saw them enter. "For Hogwarts again, Mrs. Fig told the owl, holding out the two envelopes. The owl took them, one in its beak, one in its foot, then flapped into the air and out the window. The curtain drifted in the breeze of its passage, slowly fell back to rest. "There. We'll be hearing back from them in a few hours, I expect. In the meantime, what shall we do with ourselves?" Harry shrugged. He had no idea what normal people did during the day, any more than he knew what wizards did during the day. He only knew what he and Dudley did. "I shall teach you to play dominoes," Mrs. Fig said to Harry's indifference. "That will pass the time quite nicely, I believe." It was a calm game, a quiet game which allowed for casual conversation and strategy, and Harry enjoyed immensely. They played a dozen games, the table growing more and more covered in the little porcelain tiles with each progressive round. She had double 12s, so they had plenty of tiles to work with, but he found himself growing increasingly restless as the day wore on. He was used to action, to moving, and had more energy than he knew what to do with. Mrs. Fig clearly had no idea what to do with him either, but he didn't want to insult her hospitality. A hoot from the back room interrupted them, and Harry was surprised to find it nearly lunchtime. Mrs. Fig hurried off to the owl room, stepping around the dozen snakes that had taken up residence on her floor, and returned with a pair of letters. "Both for you, dear." She set about assembling sandwiches while Harry opened the first. "Mr. Potter. While your circumstances are cause for concern, we cannot allow you to leave your aunt and uncle's residence until the proper start of term. As they are your guardians, you must remain in their home during the summer holidays. However, we understand that they must be made to see the truth of your situation. Your parents already made it clear that they intended you to be a proper wizard, and your name has been down since you were born. So long as you choose to come, you cannot be prevented from attending Hogwarts at this point by anything your Muggle guardians attempt. We believed that a letter had been given to them explaining everything, but it seems they may not have received it after all. A school representative is on his way. He will explain matters to them in person, and make arrangements for your trip to Diagon Alley for your school things. Thank you. Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry opened the second, a much shorter reply than he'd ever seen. We'll meet you in Diagon Alley. Don't let on we've met. See you soon. Your friend, Quirinus Quirrell. Harry grinned, eager to see the professor again. First, though, he had to get through the interview with the Dursleys. Harry, come and meet your Hogwarts representative, Mrs. Fig called. Harry had feared the pounding at the door meant Uncle Vernon's return, but it seemed not to be the case. The man standing outside was huge. Vaster than any of the Dursleys' relatives, taller and wider than Harry had guessed it possible for anyone to be. He had a wild beard and hair, wore a heavy coat with more pockets than Harry had ever seen in one place. Rubius Hagrid, the man said, his voice deep and accented heavily. Lovely Termicha again, Harry. Yeh ver grown up nice since I last saw yeh. I don't remember meeting you before, Harry said, sure he would have. Mr. Hagrid was very distinctive. Course you wouldn't, you was only a babe at the time. I brought you here, to Dumbledore, after your parents, well, after that night. Dumbledore? Harry asked. The Hogwarts headmaster? What does he have to do with it? He's in charge of your affairs, innit? Harry's heart skipped a beat as he felt the information fade behind the veil in his mind. Albus Dumbledore was the Watcher? The headmaster of the school he was about to attend was? He couldn't think about that yet. He filed it away, resolved to ask Quirrell just what Dumbledore had done to be labeled as their adversary. But not now. He let the veil fall over the knowledge. My aunt and uncle hated me, Harry said. Mr. Hagrid looked sad and angry all at once. Hated you? Jealous, maybe, but that's no cause. No, Harry interrupted. They actually hate me. I don't know why. But I don't think they realize how famous I am to wizards, and I'm sure they wouldn't care. We'll see about that, Mr. Hagrid said. He beckoned to Harry. Come on, let's go tell them how it'll go. Harry followed the huge man down the street, smiling at the thought of what the Dursleys would think when their neighbors saw this wild giant of a man coming to their front door. It was almost enough to overcome his dread, but he couldn't help thinking that something would go wrong. Hagrid banged on the Dursleys' front door, the sound carrying across the neighborhood. Open up, Dursley. Mr. Hagrid shouted. I need a word with ye. Petunia opened the door so quickly Harry knew she must have run. She stared up at the giant at her door with big, scared eyes, then caught sight of Harry standing beside him. Her expression tightened. We don't want any of your sort around here, she said. If you've come to bring the boy back, well, he ran away from us. I have been true to my word. Yeah, and a fat lot of good it did him. You be good to th boy, you hear? And no more talk of him not attending Hogwarts. He'll be comin' and that's the end of it. We swore when we took him in that we'd put an end to that freakishness. My sister got herself killed because of that nonsense, and we'll not have that happen again. Harry was surprised by this. He wouldn't have guessed the Dursleys cared whether he lived or died. Funny way of showing affection, he muttered, too quiet for her to hear. Yeh swore a more important oath when ye took him under yer roof, Mr. Hagrid said firmly. To care for him and protect him. And we have done that, Petunia snapped. We have fed him, clothed him, given him space though he's as ungrateful as ever a boy could be, and he just up and runs off on us like this. Because ye wouldn't listen, obviously. The huge man's voice had risen, and Petunia took a furtive look around. She looked half as though she wanted to bring Mr. Hagrid inside just so no one would see him standing on her front step, and partly as though she couldn't bear the thought of him setting foot indoors. What more can you demand of us? We have done everything for the boy. Ha! Harry couldn't hold it in. You've done nothing but the barest minimum to get by. If you could get away with it, you'd do even less. You hear? Petunia snapped. Ungrateful to the last. Well, he's stayin' through August, and be back any summer too, and ungrateful or not ye'll take good care of him. Understand? And he will have his own owl, so we'll expect to be hearin' from him regular like. Vernon would never allow, Petunia began, but Hagrid cut her off. You will allow him to write, and thaw's the end of it. Petunia wilted under his glare, unable to hold her ground against the sheer volume Mr. Hagrid represented. Now, I'm taking him for his books and things, we'll be back in a few hours. Remember, Dursley. Petunia watched him warily as they turned to leave, then shut the door firmly. Now? Harry asked, excited. We're going to buy my wand and magic things now. Mr. Hagrid grinned. Yeah, I've got other business in town too, so yeah, he'll fit right in. Our new defense professor offered to show you around while I take care of affairs at the bank, so you can get to know at least one of our faculty. He's much better than the last two, seems to be. I'll be sorry to lose him. What do you mean? Harry asked. Well, is not anything real, Mr. Hagrid said, looking uncomfortable, but it's been a long time since we had a defense professor stay longer than a year. They just can't take it, I suppose. Sometimes you think they will, but then there's an accident, or they turn out to be embezzling, or they've gotten too attached to certain students. The big man sighed. I hope this year turns out all right. He was teaching Muggle studies for a bit now. He's a nice lad, hope nothing terrible happens to him. He traveled abroad, came back this year all excited to teach everyone what he learned. Bit touchy about vampires now, though, wonder what happened. Chapter 9, The Curious Ways of Magic. The Curious Ways of Magic. Harry had never been to London before, but even visiting the city seemed pale and ordinary compared to the knowledge that they were about to be shopping for his magic things. We can really buy all this here? Harry asked. They had passed nearly every sort of shop imaginable, but nowhere that looked remotely magical. If ye know where to look, Mr. Hagrid said, pointing to a dingy-looking pub. The Leaky Cauldron, famous place it is. Come on. Harry had the distinct feeling that no one on the street actually saw the pub at all, no one was going into it, no one was looking at it properly. He grinned. A hidden magic place right in the middle of London. He hoped its dreary exterior was just a cover, but the interior was dark and shabby enough to match its outside facade perfectly. Before he could look around more closely, he noticed the atmosphere of the room change. He felt as though everyone just stopped their conversations to stare at him. He held his arms closer to his sides, suddenly very aware of his rolled-up pants and oversized shirt sleeves, watched the huge man's back and tried not to attract attention. The usual, Hagrid? Asked the barkeeper. Not today, Tom, I'm on Hogwarts business. Behind the close conversation, a background hum had started back up. More hushed, more reverent. Harry heard his name at least a dozen times over. Right age for it, never did hear where the old man hid. What is he wearing? I must have it for myself. Harry felt his face heating. He would probably die laughing if oversized Muggle clothing became fashionable in wizard circles because of him. The barman peered at him more closely. Can it be? Harry started, but his voice squeaked. He cleared his throat nervously, reached up his hand. Harry Potter, pleased to meet you. The barman's grin widened. Thank you, Mr. Potter. He shook Harry's hand firmly. Thank you. It is him. A woman in the crowd exclaimed. Harry Potter, welcome back. And then everyone in the room were on their feet, surging forward, shaking Harry's hand, introducing themselves. Some had tears in their eyes as they thanked him, some stared at him with such pride that he felt even more uncomfortable. You're welcome, he murmured back, nice to meet you too. Thank you. You're welcome. Then a familiar face jolted him out of the moment. He reached automatically to shake the hand, then froze. This is Professor Quirrell, Harry, I was telling you about him. He'll help ye at the bank and shopping. I've a few other things to take care of. Diagon Alley is safe, no one'll bother ye here. Nice to meet you, Professor, Harry said, giving a polite nod. He managed not to grin, but it was a close thing. Likewise, Mr. Potter. I hope you've had a good summer. Harry smiled, secretively. Better than most, thank you, Professor. Yeah, well, time to be on, come on you two. Mr. Hagrid started off, his massive form clearing a swath through the crowd for Harry and Professor Quirrell to follow in his wake. He reached the walled-off area out the back door, tapped a particular pattern of bricks with a bright pink umbrella, and the wall folded itself away, forming an elegant brick archway instead. Welcome to Diagon Alley, Mr. Hagrid said, and here Harry finally had his first proper look into the wizard world. The shops were partly just like normal shops, but everything seemed to shine as though freshly polished. No everyday grime was allowed to build up, making the street look almost unrealistic. And then there were the items for sale, cauldrons, broomsticks, parchment and quills, an entire storefront dedicated to toads. Harry heard a pair of witches on the street debating over a storefront display whether the higher point or a folded point hat would go better with her dress robes, and he thought how strange it was that it felt completely natural to think of everyone in sight as witches and wizards. They arrived at the bank, a great marble structure with bronze doors and a swarthy-faced not-human person, about a head shorter than Harry himself. Goblins, Professor Quirrell told him quietly. No safer place in the world to store valuables. "Except maybe Hogwarts, Mr. Hagrid put in." The red-uniformed goblin bowed as the trio entered. They passed through silver doors with a long poem engraved upon them, but Harry was already looking past them to the row of goblin tellers positioned inside the vast marble room. About 100 goblins worked this main area. At his guess, dozens sat at the counter on high stools to talk to customers, others sat at desks behind, measuring and weighing, examining gemstones. It was a flurry of activity, measured and precise in each of its parts, but overwhelming to take in all at once. Mr. Hagrid pulled out a small key from his coat pocket and handed it to Harry. "Don't lose that," he said. "I'll need it back once you finish. It's very important." Harry nodded. Professor Quirrell led him up to the counter. "Mr. Harry Potter would like to access his vault," he said. The goblin peered down at Harry. "Key." Harry handed it up. He saw Mr. Hagrid at another teller, leaning close and talking quietly, place a sealed envelope on the counter. "Very good." The goblin's voice brought Harry's attention back to his own teller. The creature motioned behind him, and yet another goblin rushed forward. "Griphook will escort you to the vault." Griphook led them through a side door, down a narrow stone passageway lit with torches and to a small railway track that twisted across their path deeper underground. Griphook whistled, and a cart rushed forward along the tracks. He motioned them to follow him inside it, then tapped Harry's key against the front of the cart. It set off, down twisting and turning passages, steering itself onto one set of tracks or another, seeming completely sure of itself with no need of further direction. They finally stopped, Harry grinning and breathless from the wild ride, Quirrell looking less pleased with it. "Didn't remember them going so fast," he mumbled, leaning against the wall. Griphook unlocked the door, letting out a cloud of green smoke. As it cleared, Harry gasped in astonishment. He knew intellectually that he was rich, but it was another matter entirely to be confronted with a huge pile of gold, silver, and bronze coins shining in perfect stacks. "Is this?" Harry asked. "Yours. Every newt of it." "Galleons," Quirrell said as he began counting gold coins into a bag Griphook provided. 17 sickles to a galleon, he pointed to the silver coins. "And 29 nuts to a sickle. It's a bit tricky to catch on at first, but you'll get it." "Galleon, sickle, nut," Harry repeated, looking at each type of coin in turn. 17, 29. He knew he'd forget, but kept repeating the numbers anyway. "There," Quirrell said, handing the bag to Griphook. The goblin weighed it in one hand, listened to the sound it made, then wrote a small notation on his book. "Withdrawal verified," he said. He handed the bag back, closed the door and returned Harry's key, then led them back to the cart. Harry thought he saw another little vehicle go whipping past them, heading the opposite direction as they headed back up the winding tracks at almost the same speed with which they'd hurtled down them. He blinked as they emerged from the bank to the bright afternoon. "I don't think I need to ask where you'd like to go first," Quirrell said, nodding toward a narrow storefront with peeling gold letters. "Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. Harry grinned. "You're right." They entered the shabby little store, accompanied by the tinkle of a little bell somewhere farther in. The cramped interior was quiet and dusty, the exact opposite of most of Diagon Alley, full of shelves stacked with little boxes. Thousands of them. It reminded Harry a bit of a shoe store's back room. His skin seemed to prickle with the power in the air. He could feel his magic now, sense it waiting, reaching for something. He gave a quiet, nervously excited laugh, but swallowed the sound quickly. He stared at the stack of boxes, following it up to the ceiling and back down, trying to count the tiny long boxes. "Good afternoon." Harry almost jumped, startled. He hadn't seen the old man come out from the back. "Mr. Ollivander peered at Harry with wide, pale eyes. "Harry Potter, yes. You have your mother's eyes." "Thank you," Harry said, not sure what else to say. "Quirinus, I remember you. Do you still use the wand I sold you? Something feels different about you this year." 9 inches, alder, unicorn hair, Quirrell replied, drawing out the wand, giving it a quick twirl. Harry thought it looked smaller and more ordinary in the light of day. He must have exaggerated it in his memory. Bendy, good for protection charms. Yes. Ollivander's pale silver eyes seemed to linger on Quirrell for a long moment, then he turned back to Harry. Which is your wand arm? I'm right-handed. Ollivander nodded, brought out a tape measure which set about measuring Harry's body on its own. Hold out your arm. Good. He flitted about the shelves, pulling boxes seemingly at random, stacking them on the desk. Try this, he said, offering Harry the first. Beechwood and dragon heartstring, 9 inches. Harry took the wand, had time only to notice a faint shining feeling in his fingers before Ollivander snatched it back. The wandmaker offered him one after another, rattling off the name of its ingredients and its length, occasionally adding a note about what it would be best suited for. Each felt about the same, the quiet tingle of latent magic, but nothing as dramatic as when he'd used Quirrell's wand. He thought he understood what Ollivander was trying to do, but he couldn't see how the wandmaker would be able to see so quickly whether or not Harry felt anything from the wands. He didn't give enough time. They worked through the first stack, and Ollivander smiled and flitted about collecting a second. None of these produced any effect, and he set about gathering a third pile. He seemed to be growing more and more eager as they went through dozens of wands, the stack of rejects on the desk growing higher and higher. Harry wondered how long it would take him to put them all back in their places. Then Ollivander hesitated. He looked at Harry, then slowly reached up and pulled out a single box. Why not give this one a try, he said quietly. Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple. Harry took the wand, expecting something dramatic to happen. The wood felt smooth and sparkling under his hand. Nothing happened for a long moment, but Harry did feel a distinct warmth from the wand. He got the impression it was waiting for something from him. Curious, Ollivander said. I've never seen such a strong, yet subdued reaction. Give it a wave, will you? Harry brought the wand up in front of him like Quirrell had showed him, whispered Loomis, though he hadn't planned to. The tip flared to life, momentarily brightening the dim shop, casting sharp shadows across Mr. Ollivander's face. Then the light flickered, faded. Most curious indeed. Ollivander took the wand, replaced it in the box, but didn't move the box to the pile of rejected wands. He tapped his long fingers on the box instead, watching Harry with an amused expression. I dearly wish I had another wand with a matching core. I feel like the holly wood is the problem here, but no two phoenixes are the same and they are temperamental in the extreme. Alas, the only other feather from that phoenix is long since gone into the world. Ollivander tapped his fingers again on the box. We could keep searching, but I have a feeling on this, a very strong feeling that this is the wand you are destined for. Which is curious in its own right. But its subdued reaction to you is even stranger. The wand chooses the wizard, you see, but this wand seems to have reservations about you. Curious. Does that mean it won't work right for me? It will be hard to control. Harry asked, worried. He didn't want a picky wand to get in his way. It is a supple wand, which should adapt well to you given time, if it decides you are the right fit. I would worry, though, sending you out with only 2/3 of a proper match. It could go either way, you see. Should we keep trying? If you wish. I have a few more unique combinations we could try. He whisked away to the back, returned a minute later with another armload of wands. Acacia and dragon heartstring, 10 inches, bendy. Very tricky combination. Harry felt the wand as sharp, not uncomfortable but obvious. There was a connection, but it was not strong. He brought the wand up in front of him, but felt no particular reaction. I thought not. I've had this one back there for over 50 years now. Tricky combination. Needs a firm hand, but the right mind. Cypress and unicorn hair, 9.5 inches, rigid. Harry shook his head, handed it back. He knew what he was looking for now, understood the way a normal wand would feel, knew the slight variations that marked their types. He was worried, now, his reaction to Quirrell's wand had been stronger than his own, and none of these rare combinations seemed to be working out any better for him. Ollivander returned to his front shelves, offered Harry an array of his more standard combinations, tried various woods with various other phoenix feathers, but his smile seemed wistful or contemplative now, not entirely genuine. I fear we shall not find a better match for you, Ollivander said, tapping on the single box. Curious are the ways of magic. But I now believe you will come to an accord. Rarely have I seen so strong a connection. Harry nodded. He hadn't realized so much effort went into choosing a wand. He paid the wandmaker and took the wand in his hand again, felt the weighting and warmth, the tingle through him of magic at rest. He nodded, his worry fading. Reluctant or no, the wand felt right. Thank you. I think we must expect great things from you, Ollivander said softly. The brother to this wand you have already encountered and defeated once, and that wand was destined for great things. Terrible, yes, but none can deny the greatness. You and this wand, I suspect, shall go farther than most of us could imagine. Lord Voldemort was the one who bought the other? Harry asked, turning back to Ollivander. Yes. If I'd known then what that wand would go on to do, if I had guessed when creating it the terrible places it would lead our world, but it also crafted new magics unheard of in our time. The dark mark alone is an unparalleled piece of magic. Understanding even a fraction of the genius that led to our near destruction would be a great gift to wizards for centuries to come. Ollivander shook his head. The future, the past, they can be altered but never changed. Rewritten, but never undone. It is not well to linger on what might have been. Learn from what is, what has been. That is all we can seek to do. Harry nodded, not exactly following. Nice meeting you, Harry said, though the wandmaker seemed a little off. Harry wished he would blink more often. And you, Harry? Ollivander's voice was quiet. He bowed in farewell. Thank you, Harry said, and followed Professor Quirrell back outside. Harry breathed a sigh of relief as they emerged into the brightness and fresh air of Diagon Alley. The stuffy, magic-heavy atmosphere inside Ollivander's had been invigorating, but stifling at the same time. He and Quirrell walked down the street, crowded with wizards and witches and children. A pair of boys were arguing over which one got to ride a toy broomstick. A girl stood with her face pressed against an apothecary shop window. A pair of black-robed wizards swept down the street like it belonged to them, engrossed in their own conversation. They purchased the rest of Harry's school equipment, as well as a hefty trunk that was a bit larger than its outside would indicate. He was fitted for robes, stood quietly while the shopmistress measured and pinned, and then waited while she made a few modifications with a dozen needles that flashed as they flew about at her wand gestures. Harry couldn't wait to get home and start reading his school books. The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, seemed especially promising. Mr. Hagrid met them outside the seamstress's shop, carrying a cage with a lovely white spotted owl. It's a few days early, but I thought you'd like to have her now. Happy birthday, Harry. Harry grinned. He'd never had such a nice birthday present, and he didn't care that it was a few days early. He felt like he'd never smiled so wide before in his life. Thank you, Hagrid, she's wonderful. He remembered to give back his bank vault key, though that brought to mind thoughts of Albus Dumbledore, headmaster, watcher. He glanced at Quirrell, cursing himself for not having thought to ask for more information the whole time they were alone shopping. That veil in his memory was proving more trouble than he'd have anticipated. It didn't prevent him from thinking about anything, but it did make it harder. Despite his attempts to practice using it back at Privet Drive, it seemed that only when he had a reason to allow it open did all his questions come flooding back to the forefront of his thoughts. With Mr. Hagrid back in charge of Harry's trip, Professor Quirrell bowed his farewells and strode off down the street. Still, Harry had an owl of his very own now. He could send letters any time he wanted. He just couldn't ask about anything sensitive. How had he gone a whole afternoon ignoring something so mysterious? He reached in his pocket, wrapped his hand around the worn wand handle. He knew how. The world of magic was just opening up to him. How could he worry about some nebulous feud between a professor and the headmaster, when there was so much to see? He put it out of his thoughts. All too soon, the whirlwind of shopping and magic came to an end. As they were about to leave Diagon Alley, Mr. Hagrid stopped. Harry, I think I should tell ye, underage wizards aren't allowed to do magic except in school or when being supervised by an adult wizard or witch. The Ministry of Magic can track wand use, so make sure ye don't get too carried away with yer studies. Got it? Harry nodded, disappointed. He'd looked forward to practicing spells, but if it was illegal he didn't want to get in trouble. He could wait a month. And he could still memorize everything in the Standard Book of Spells. Though, he remembered Quirrell's emphasis on pronunciation and rhythm when teaching him Loomis. Maybe it would be best to not risk learning it wrong, wait until he had teachers to mimic the correct sound and flow of the words. Mr. Hagrid left Harry with his tickets for the train, the Hogwarts Express, on September 1st. Platform 9 3/4, remember, Hagrid said. The Hogwarts letter had instructions to reach it, Harry said. Mr. Hagrid laughed. Used to be they'd just trust people to work it out. These days everything has to be spelled out so exact. Harry shrugged. I wouldn't have been able to work it out. It's not exactly intuitive. To a wizard. Raised by muggles, Harry pointed out. Mr. Hagrid grunted. Well. He delivered Harry to 4 Privet Drive, by which time Vernon had returned from work. They had a loud discussion, which ended with Hagrid glaring threateningly at Harry's uncle as though he would spear him through with a pink umbrella, and Vernon agreeing shakily and grudgingly that they would be sure Harry was able to write and that they would bring him to King's Cross Station at the correct time. Mr. Hagrid accepted their concessions, waved cheerily to Harry, and walked off down the street. It's time you cleared out Dudley's second bedroom, that place is a mess, Aunt Petunia snapped. And put that horrid owl somewhere out of sight. Harry shoved his trunk into his cupboard, moved his mattress on top of it. Though it left him with barely enough room to lie down, he wouldn't be able to sit up without ducking his head. He set his owl's cage on top of the mattress, though he couldn't think where he could put her when he needed to sleep. He smiled to her anyway, patted her feathery head before hurrying about his chores. It wasn't her fault he didn't have any space, and he would be sure to take care of her as best he possibly could.